Please welcome Chris, Chief Strategy Officer at Xsolla, Anthony, Chief Strategy Officer at Sensor Tower, and our moderator, Gina Joseph.
Chris, Anthony, it's so good to have you both here today.
Thank you, Gina. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Gina.
Well, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about how strategy is shaping the future of games. So let's jump right into it. Chris, why don't we start with you? 2025 has proven to be a transformational year for the industry. Where do you think this is going to take us regarding direction and growth in the marketplace for studios?
So, obviously the elephant in the room is the Epic versus Apple development from a couple of weeks ago, but I think that is really just part of the broader narrative around direct-to-consumer, which has been an ongoing building trend for the entire industry. And we have seen that, companies that really embrace that direct-to-consumer model are seeing a lot of success. And I love the fact that it's just opening up. And as we said, with Epic versus Apple, it's become a lot easier for mobile. It's been that way in PC for quite a while, but I think that's the big story for this year.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. And I've never seen so many people at Sensor Tower become legal scholars overnight, but it's absolutely been a key legal situation in our world. I think what I'd like to point out, though, is even though there clearly are tailwinds for direct-to-consumer, at Sensor Tower, we really do see a lot of health and vibrance in the traditional app stores for Apple and Google. So in 2024, we saw 4% growth year over year in in-app purchase revenue, eclipsing the $80 billion mark. I think what's even more exciting about that is there were significant headwinds in Asia. So if you just look at the US, if you look at Latin America, you look at Europe, most of those markets were up double digit in terms of revenue. So we're seeing revenue growth through Apple and Google kind of as strong as it's been in a decade if you kind of exclude the 2 COVID years. So I think, with the success that games are finding in Apple and Google, as well as some of the opportunities in direct-to-consumer, there's going to be a lot of decision-making that needs to be done as to what is the better approach, because I think there are pros and cons to both routes. Apple and Google, obviously they offer a frictionless experience. I think they're trusted names. I think there's value in the privacy that they provide. However, I could see, owning the relationship with the customers as well as the profitability benefits of the direct-to-consumer model.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Anthony, that this whole model is not an either or. It's not about leaving platforms to go direct to consumer. It's about expanding your business to embrace both. Platforms are great because they have the audiences, they have the volume of players, and they help with some discoverability, although that has become an issue. But if you do expand beyond the platforms, we're seeing that it's not only a margin improvement, but you mentioned revenue growth. We're seeing the ability to actually grow your revenue by developing that direct relationship with your players through embracing all of the power of direct e-commerce, whether that's things like behavioral pricing, regional pricing, live ops, limited time offers, whatever it may be. Once you get outside of the App Store, you can really grow your business. And for us, we're seeing on average people that expand beyond the App Store are growing 14 to 16% additional revenue on top of what they're already making because they're able to maximize that value with their players.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic, something GamesBeat's going to be following pretty closely. Dean went deep, did a deep dive on it in one of his newsletters, and I know Chris, you were featured in that. So we'll be watching that developing story. Anthony, what trends do you see in the market, and are there any outliers you expect to change or shift significantly this year?
Yeah, so one trend we've been following is just the continued growth of revenue coming from legacy games. And we define legacy games as games that have been in the market for more than 6 years. The share of revenue coming from these titles is now eclipsing 50% of in-app purchase revenue, which I think is really interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, I think these games are doing an extraordinary job of keeping gamers engaged with live ops and new competitions and new modes and new experiences. And I think it's also creating, a ton of competition for new game launches. So new game launches, thanks to some of the advancements in AI, are potentially easier than ever because there's things that smaller teams can do now that they couldn't have done a couple years ago. But it really is a complicated and competitive environment. So I think understanding how games find an audience, how they grow that audience, and how they sort of compete with some of the really well-entrenched players is something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and to echo the audience part of that conversation, I think for us we're really seeing companies that embrace that building the relationship with their audience, with their players, sort of creating an interconnected ecosystem beyond just any single platform, but being able to bring the entire experience together and raise the value proposition for their players. There's a lot of additional revenue opportunities there, and whether you're small or big, right? But being able to connect directly with your players, connect to them to a broader ecosystem. We've seen the data that shows that really does create a lift in regards to your business.
As two individuals driving strategy at your organizations and with your partners, where do you see the most significant untapped opportunities? Where do you think they exist today?
Yeah, I think obviously I'll keep harping on the direct-to-consumer side of the conversation, but I think also emerging markets. We're seeing markets in Africa and Middle East that are really, really growing for games. The populations are young, they're very digital savvy, they're very mobile, and I believe in Africa we're looking at maybe 14 billion this year in projected revenue, 16 or 17 in the Middle East, North Africa. So I think this is a whole region that is ripe for opportunity, not just from a consumer standpoint, but also from a developer standpoint. And there's funding that's coming through those areas, and the markets are just, I think, really good for growth. And that's where we're seeing a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, and I actually want to revisit a point that Chris made a minute ago. So I think some of the appeal in the direct-to-consumer model is owning the relationship with your audience and your consumers. I think one thing we see at Sensor Tower, especially now that we have access to PC and console data, is really the value in having this cross-channel experience and having your game available through all the channels where gamers play. It's almost just becoming the expectation where consumers want everything, everywhere, all the time. So sometimes you're playing on your mobile, sometimes you're on your PC, sometimes you're on your console. So making sure your games are available cross-platform is just becoming the new standard and is imperative. I think sort of an adjacent point to that is the importance of transmedia. And I think it's no surprise to people in this audience that some of the most creative IP coming out of entertainment is games right now. And that's what Hollywood is looking for new TV shows and for movies. So just having that really immersive IP where customers and consumers are engaging with it everywhere is now driving things beyond games. We look at the success of the Minecraft movie, you look at HBO's The Last of Us, you look at Fallout on Amazon Prime in 2024. I think what's so cool is not only are these pieces of scripted content hearkening back to games, and then they're driving the successful TV and movies, but then when those pieces of content launch, they actually bring consumers back to the games. So it's such a cool flywheel. Like we saw in our data when Fallout was on, all of a sudden Fallout 4 and Fallout 76 users and revenue was spiking on PC and console. So it really is this flywheel that just, I think, energizes the entire industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think games in Hollywood is definitely a space we're watching closely and will continue to do. We had a panel on it, at GamesBeat Summit, and we have our Games in Hollywood Summit that we host every December. But speaking of Minecraft, how many folks in the room watched the movie? Just curious.
Chicken
All right.
jockey.
Well, my daughter loved it. In fact, when we went, it was so cute because there was a scene and she jumped up with her friends and they did a TikTok dance. There's just so many things that happen, that amongst, you think of the culture and the movement and the impact it has on future generations. Speaking of strategy, it's hard to talk about strategy and not talk about AI. We naturally have 6 sessions at the summit covering AI. So, Chris, how do you think emerging technologies and AI will impact game development, publishing, and business operations over the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I think AI presents a lot of opportunity. Obviously, there's a lot of mixed feelings about AI. And I've had a lot of conversations here where I think there's, we're going through the hype of it all. I use it every day, right? I find it to be a real sort of productivity enhancer. But I do think we're going through a phase where there's the hype, there's the idea that, it can actually diminish the amount of resources needed to create content, but we're now moving into a phase where that's coming up against consumer expectations, and consumers don't care about a business that can use AI to sort of reduce the amount of resources, right, to make something. They want more from it. So for me, I think AI, once we get through sort of this initial phase and we learn how people are really implementing it, using it to be a productivity enhancer, for me the conversation is really about what does it mean for the consumer, and the consumer expectation is going to be bigger, better, more in-depth games, more deeper experiences that AI allows you to create. So it's not about sort of reducing teams or reducing the size of your company. It's about being able to create something bigger, deeper, more engaging, and I'm pretty bullish on it. And I think also AI can help not just in producing content, but when you think of it again from the consumer perspective, it can. And I really haven't seen a lot of this yet, but I'm excited to see how it can help with discoverability, because that is, especially when we talk about direct-to-consumer, getting outside of platforms, discoverability becomes the next big frontier, and I think AI could really help with that.
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly, Chris. I think AI really has the potential to level the playing field a bit. I think in terms of advertising, I think it makes advertising a lot more doable for smaller teams. I think there's the opportunity to target gamers at a much more sort of micro level where they're getting the right offers or they're seeing the right advertisements. I do wonder if in the next 12 to 24 months, so many gaming studios are employing these very optimal tactics that are driven by AI. What it ends up doing is sort of putting the emphasis back on the quality of the game and the experience that consumers are going to have on the game. Because the advertising, I think everybody is going to be using similar tools to find the same players. I think the monetization opportunities might be consistent across the board. What's going to be different from game to game is the quality of the game, the immersiveness of the experience, the ability for consumers to engage with that content across different modalities. So I think there's probably going to be this 1 to 2 year period where the companies that use AI as a substitute are going to do less well, and the companies that use AI as an opportunity to amplify their efforts are going to do better. But then after that period, I think it's going to go back to how good is the underlying game, and that's probably where the emphasis should be.
Yeah. The question should almost be, how do you think AI is going to impact us tomorrow, right? 12 to 18 months feels far from now when you think about how transformative this technology is. But it will be interesting to look back at this conversation and see where we are in a year. With the advancements of tech and the availability of networks and access worldwide, where do the following opportunities exist for all of us, Anthony?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of opportunity internationally. As we were just kind of citing the Apple and Google growth figures, we saw double-digit growth in Latin America, double-digit growth in Europe, almost 20% growth in the Middle East. Even in Asia, where there are some headwinds, I think there's opportunities for Western developers to make content that really resonates with some of those huge markets. I think what's really important, though, is that developers enter those markets with a respect and an understanding of what resonates with those consumers. And I think AI can really help with that, but making sure the content is regionally appropriate, making sure the advertising is both stylistically appropriate for those gamers, as well as the advertisements are placed through where those gamers are spending their time. You know, the footprint of social networks differs from continent to continent. You know, the type of advertisements also may have some idiosyncrasies. So I think, you know, there are tons of opportunities in these regions, but I don't think you could just ham-fistedly take a game that's successful in the West and put it there. You know, there has to be some acknowledgement that, you know, these markets are different, the type of genres that are successful in those markets are different, and the consumers expect to have content that is going to resonate with them.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that makes a lot of sense. And I know that I was talking with a developer the other day who's actually specifically funded to create content regionally in India. And the idea there is these markets are becoming big enough that, you know, you can create content that is localized and specific for the region. But for you know, most companies, I think to your point, being able to have a regional approach, not just to the content that you're creating, but to the pricing, to the advertising, all of that is incredibly important. And these markets are large, right? They have become extremely large, you know, so it is definitely worth everybody's time to look at how can they, you know, sort of cater to those markets. And AI is certainly a good tool to help with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think this last question, you know, that time flew by. You know, this last question I love because it seems really fitting in terms of why we host GamesBeat Summit and why we're all here. You know, we don't see the leaders in this room slowing down anytime soon. And so where do you think we collectively need to focus or do better to bring opportunities together to ensure the industry's growth and expansion?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about a little bit of a mind shift. Like, I love talking about the fact that games, for me, I like to think of games as they're a hobby, right? And it's not a game. If you really think of games and from a consumer perspective, that consumers treat games now as a hobby, the same way that they would treat golf or biking or any other sort of hobby that people engage with, it kind of shifts a little bit your mindset on how you engage with those consumers. And all of a sudden, the idea that somebody might spend thousands of dollars a year on their hobby, you know, or on games, it shifts when you think of it through that lens. And it really gets to that idea of a full ecosystem that you're connecting together when you go direct to your players and direct to your consumers. And, you know, I just did a conversation with the CFO from Niantic, Jeff Sugar, and he talks about how with Pokemon Go, they have the game, but they have their festivals, and they're connecting everything together, and it's creating this bigger ecosystem for their players. And I think that is the real growth opportunity as we go forward with games.
Yeah, I think where mind goes with this question is just, you know, something I always come back to at Sensor Tower, which is consumer engagement is finite. It may not seem that way. In our State of Mobile report that came out in January, we found that there were 4.2 trillion hours of global engagement on mobile apps. It came out to 3.5 hours per person per day, which honestly sounds really low. Like, I think I've been on my phone for more than 3.5 hours already today. But I think what it means is that games are going to have and already have competition outside of games. I mean, we've already seen sort of the cross-pollination of things like Netflix, where they're trying to have games, or sort of the very blurry lines between games and social networks. So as games continues to grow its footprint, and as some of these mega games continue to push the boundaries on how long you could keep a consumer engaged per day, I think there needs to be an acknowledgement of the real threat coming from other forms of entertainment, whether that's social, whether that's streaming. I mean, it could be dating. You know, when you're spending hours a day in a certain piece of property, your competitors are not necessarily other games, but they could be Netflix. And I think years ago, Netflix CEO Reed Hastings said, you know, we don't look at competition from other streaming services, we look at competition as Fortnite. And I think games are getting to the point where they have to look at that from an inverse perspective, where, you know, the more minutes per day people are spending on TikTok or YouTube are fewer minutes that people are are playing mobile games. And for that reason, I think it's why, being available through all these channels, PC, console, mobile, making sure you can monetize through different avenues, whether that's through advertising or in-app purchases or a direct-to-consumer relationship. I just think the expectation is becoming, we need to be everywhere. And I think as long as games have that approach, they're going to continue to see some of the growth that they've had in the last 12 months plus.
And just to add on that, the one advantage I think that games really have, besides just being deeply engaging, is spend depth, right? When you talk about Netflix or TikTok or these other channels, it's very limited spend depth. But with games, you can just really have deep spend with your players. So even though they might be engaging on other platforms, they can go, if you really capture their hearts and minds and their wallets, you can go very deep on the revenue side.
Yeah, I love that. 4.2 trillion, you said?
Yeah, 4.2 trillion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that might have just been in my household.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you both, definitely dropped some big statistics here this morning, but these are important things. We need to be realizing, what the reality is and how we're going to be creating opportunities against it. Reed Hastings, he wrote this book, No Rules, one of my favorites. But it makes sense why they tapped into gaming, and it's going to be interesting to see where they go. Any final remarks? Where are you two heading next?
Literally, I'm headed to Vegas this afternoon for another conference. I think in terms of where Sensor Tower is heading, which is usually kind of what I'm preoccupied with, I think we continue to push to better understand a consumer's very complex and circuitous journey throughout digital, which means games, but also means other forms of entertainment and advertising. We've pushed over the last year to have more stakes in the ground in other silos throughout digital, so launching web, launching PC console data. I think where we want to go next, though, is understanding the overlap between some of these medians. So when advertising is shown in one area, how does it influence behavior or purchases in another one? Because, we can all, sort of think through the time it's a Sunday and you're sitting on the couch and you're playing a game, you're watching TV, you got a laptop open, you have advertisements coming at you from every which way. How does that influence behavior, and on what channel are you kind of engaging with these services?
Yeah, for me, I'm just heading back to the office. So we've got a lot of work to do to help our partners take advantage of the recent Epic versus Apple ruling and going direct to consumer and all of that. So.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Anthony and Chris, for your time this morning. It was an absolute pleasure, and I learned a lot. Thanks.
Thanks,
Gina.